when to reopen. New details in the Trump administration's attempts to fight the coronavirus while also trying to save the economy. Speaking out, what Cardinal George Pell is saying about the origins of the sexual abuse charges he faced. A call for unity. Pope Francis says something good can come from the deadly COVID-19 outbreak. We'll explain. And racing down the aisle, a Catholic couple tells us about their unusual wedding ceremony. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, April 14th, 2020. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight, the White House and a number of state governors are considering how to gradually reopen the economy. But who actually calls the shots? That is a matter of heated debate. The president has said it's up to him, but governors are making clear they will wait until it's safe. Correspondent Owen Jensen reports.
Tracy, today the president met with COVID-19 survivors. This as the nation tries to move forward. President Donald Trump meets with those who won their battle against COVID-19.
Some were right at the edge. They thought it was over. There's a rough plague. I call it the plague. I call it the scourge. I call it whatever you want to call it. It's rough.
The survivors, of course, are very thankful.
And they need help, and you're here to address that, and I sincerely appreciate that from the both of you, from the bottom of my heart.
In the meantime, there's no question Americans are growing anxious to get going again.
We're very close to completing a plan to open our country, hopefully even ahead of schedule.
The current federal guidelines to slow the spread expire at the end of April.
We will soon finalize new and very important guidelines to give governors the information they need to start safely opening their states.
But it's governors and local leaders who have closed schools and non-essential businesses.
I think the best way to deal with this is locally. You know, every city is different. Miami is not New York.
The mayor of Miami also contracted the illness and has concerns.
We have to be worried about a second wave, which could, we would take a huge step backwards if that were to happen, and all the progress that we've made would be lost.
And the governor of Connecticut says as far as testing goes and easing restrictions,
we've ramped up our testing, but it's just 2,000 or 3,000 a day. We've got the antibody testing just in preliminary right now to see how many people have been infected. That's a start.
As for putting the open sign back up,
ultimately the virus is going to determine when we really can safely reopen, not only in general, but in a particular location.
More than 24,000 people in the United States have died from the coronavirus, but tonight, momentum is clearly building to get the country going again, and that's definitely a sign of hope. For EWTN News Nightly, I'm Owen Jensen.
Republicans and Democrats continue their standoff over the details of the next coronavirus relief bill. Meanwhile, the small business loan program created under the previous $2 trillion stimulus bill is rapidly depleting. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports.
Tracy, nationwide, as governors are weighing on how to gradually reopen the economy, small business owners are watching anxiously. The stimulus money aimed to keep small business and their employees hired could run dry by the end of this week. Congress is out, but lawmakers continue their work on this pressing problem from afar.
Those who mourn the loss of lifelong businesses.
Prayers for small business owners today on the House floor as across America their struggles grow more dire.
It's been ghost town. Like a lot of people used to come in, you know, the workers from the hardware store, plumbing supplies, all the offices around here, they used to come in for lunchtime and breakfast, and like you don't get that kind of crowd no more.
Small mom and pop stores, sometimes the only lifeline for locals.
The man's 85 years old. So we're like, you know what, even if we close down, if I have to go to my house and cook food for you, I'll do it for you.
Of the $350 billion in the Small Business Paycheck Protection Program, about $228 billion was already approved as of Monday for more than 941,000 applicants. The funds will soon run dry unless Congress approves more money. Democratic leaders accuse Republicans of supporting a program that's isolating minority-owned businesses from receiving aid. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi writes, quote, "We cannot accept Leader McConnell's proposals that would only perpetuate the flaws that are threatening the survival of the most vulnerable small businesses." Republican Senator Marco Rubio says Democrats have it all wrong. Big banks are not excluding applicants. All banks are just overwhelmed with demand.
We have to get more lenders in the program, or we're going to leave some communities behind that are struggling to get access to it through banks. But I also think it's important to understand we need more money for the program now, because if the money runs out, the guarantee won't be there and the banks will stop lending.
The House and Senate are not expected to return back to Washington until at least Monday, May 4th, unless lawmakers are called to pass emergency coronavirus measures. Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
3 U.S. bishops have issued an important reminder as concerns grow over limited medical resources. Archbishops Joseph Naumann and Paul Coakley and Bishop Kevin Rhodes write in part, quote, "Foremost in our approach to limited resources is to always keep in mind the dignity of each person and our obligation to care for the sick and dying." Joining me now on Skype to talk about the Catholic and moral considerations surrounding this issue is Dr. Joseph Meany, president of the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Dr. Meany, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here.
So when it comes to administering medical care, what exactly does church teaching say?
Sure. I mean, Catholic healthcare has an enormous tradition, right? Because it goes back to the healing ministry of Christ. And it's really seen as a ministry of the church in solidarity to our poorest, most vulnerable brothers and sisters all around the world, Catholic or not. Catholic healthcare in America is enormous. You know, it's 20% of healthcare in America. And it's very beautiful to see how much good is done through healthcare. The Catholic vision is one of really taking care of our brothers and sisters.
Dr. Meany, what should medical professionals keep in mind as they're caring for their patients?
Sure. I mean, it's such a crisis right now. And one of the terrible things about the COVID-19 disease is that people are fearful. They don't know if they have it, if they don't have it, if they should get tested or not. And there's a very strong kind of a fear factor that needs to be overcome. And knowing your doctor, being able to trust your doctor's advice is wonderful. It really helps to be in communion with someone.
Are you concerned at all that a scarcity of resources could possibly lead to discrimination against vulnerable segments of the population, people like the elderly, or maybe those with physical and intellectual challenges?
Yeah, that's certainly a big concern. Right now, we're looking at certain parts of the country, like New York City, where there's a huge influx of very seriously ill patients, and they're wondering whether they're going to have enough ventilators, whether they're going to have enough resources, enough ICU beds, et cetera, to take care of all these people, and how, if they do have to do triage, how is that going to be done? And it is so important that there is no discrimination against our most vulnerable brothers and sisters, particularly those who have disabilities or older citizens. I mean, the essential point that the church wants to remind everyone of is that we all have the same equal human dignity, and we shouldn't be discriminated against for non-clinical reasons.
Dr. Meany, going back to that previous question that I just asked you, do you think there's anything that can be done to safeguard against it?
Yes, absolutely. So some of the protocols that are being proposed, the National Catholic Bioethics Center, we are really advising all different Catholic hospitals and other hospitals and health systems as well, that they should really use objective clinical criteria when they're trying to do triage. They should not be using, life years saved. They should not be looking at, the disabilities or the quality of life of people. They should just be looking, who can we save, and what is the best clinical decision that can be made for this patient. That is what we see as the right ethical approach, and certainly in conformity with Catholic teaching.
Well, Dr. Meany, thank you so much for your time and, of course, your insight. We really appreciate it. Dr. Joseph Meany, president of the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Tracy.
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to hear arguments by phone next month, including the case of the Little Sisters of the Poor. The religious community has spent years in litigation related to the Obamacare contraception mandate. Lawyers for both sides will present their arguments next month. And you can find out more about the case from our sister publication, the National Catholic Register, at ncregister.com. North Korea fires a barrage of missiles in a major show of force. The South Korean military is reporting that the North fired short-range cruise missiles from ground launchers. People in South Korea watched TV images of the launch early this morning. Later, North Korean fighter jets also fired missiles towards the Sea of Japan. The head of the church in Sri Lanka says Catholics have forgiven the terrorists who launched a deadly bomb attack last year. Cardinal Michael Czerny says the faithful meditated on the teachings of Christ and they ended up loving and forgiving the attackers. More than 250 people were killed in strikes on Easter 2019, whose targets included 2 Catholic churches. The bombers belonged to a radical Islamic group. Australian Cardinal George Pell says the charges of child abuse against him were retribution for his fight against financial corruption in the Vatican. The former head of the Secretariat for the Economy at the Vatican told Sky News he has no proof, but some church officials think police in Australia charged him because of the trouble he caused with financial reforms. Pope Francis calls on popular movements and organizations to consider a universal base wage for unprotected workers. In a letter on Easter Sunday, the Holy Father encouraged the movements to bring change to global systems and structures that exclude those most suffering. Cardinal Michael Czerny, Undersecretary of the Vatican Office of Migrants and Refugees, joins us now from Rome. Your Eminence, thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
So what motivated Pope Francis to propose this idea of a universal base wage?
He was thinking about so many people who this emergency, this pandemic is making even more vulnerable. And he thought that under these circumstances, it was a time to think more deeply and more long-term about how people could enjoy some of the basic security and dignity that we all associate with having work.
Where do you see the balance between protecting a country's economy and also protecting people's health?
Well, I think that the balance begins with putting the emphasis on health. The economy makes little sense if we're sick and dying. So there's a priority right now on health, and I don't think that that should be balanced off by other considerations, that especially considerations that don't meet the needs of the whole population. So I would say health comes first, and the economy, which we have so much skill in arranging and working with, the economy can be adjusted to meet the needs of the people during this time.
Your Eminence, can you talk about how the Church is helping refugees amid this coronavirus pandemic, and what have been some of the challenges?
Well, the challenge, the work goes on as much as is possible. The challenge is that when people are in restricted confinement, like in refugee camps or in other facilities, they're especially vulnerable to the virus. On top of it, if they are unfortunately also excluded within society and don't have access to health care and other basic needs, that makes them very vulnerable too. But I don't think that the virus has been ravaging refugee camps, at least not so far. The concern is the bigger problem is in the developed countries of the North for the moment.
Do you think this pandemic will have a lasting impact on the Church overall?
I think it's going to have a lasting impact on all of us, I think, here on the planet. And so the Church with us will also be affected and will change, is already changing in finding creative ways of accompanying God's people in this time. And I think that's the most important thing for the Church, is to reach out and find ways of being with people so that they don't feel abandoned, that they don't feel isolated. And as the Holy Father said in his letter to the popular movements, that the Church can share the greatest gift that all of us need, which is hope. And this is also the Easter message that Christ brings us. So that's what the Church is busy doing under these very trying circumstances.
Your Eminence, a lot of people are feeling anxiety and fear right now. What would be your message to them during this time?
I would say that there are two things. One is that when one feels fear and anxiety, one of the best antidotes is to think of somebody who is even more afraid or has reason to be even more anxious and reach out to them in some way. And that helps us to actually do what Christ tells us, which is to reach out to those in need. And we find ourselves not only giving them a hand somehow, but also being healed of our own fears and anxieties. So that's very important. And the other is to join with others in all the opportunities that we have to be together. So to take part, whether especially through electronic means, to be together and to overcome the isolation and the loneliness which we all suffer because of this. But if we reach out to one another, we can help one another to live it. And as I said earlier, the Easter message of life and hope is the message that we need and that the whole world needs. So let's live it and share it to the full.
Wonderful advice. Thank you so much for your insight and joining us today. Cardinal Michael Czerny, Undersecretary of the Vatican's Migrants and Refugees Section. Thank you so much, Your Eminence.
Thank you. Bye-bye. God bless.
Coming up, a psychologist has advice on handling the stress brought by the coronavirus. Tonight, we take a closer look at the potential challenges to mental health brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. Everything from forced isolation to economic uncertainty to the unknown of how long it will all last. It all takes a toll. Joining me now on Skype to talk about this is Dr. Suzanne Holman, a psychologist and the academic dean and program director of the doctoral program in clinical psychology at Divine Mercy University. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Holman.
My pleasure, Tracy.
So it seems as if everyone, whether they or a loved one, have contracted COVID-19 or not, have been touched by this pandemic. Can you talk about the impact that a crisis like this can have on our mental well-being?
Absolutely. You know, I think for most of us, the overwhelming majority of us, this is our first pandemic. So we're not quite sure exactly what to do with this. And so we've seen everything from increases in depression and anxiety and self-medication during this time. So I think the first step is to be just very aware of where you are in terms of what are you currently doing to cope. And that will look a little bit differently for every person that we encounter.
Do you have any suggestions for people dealing with the sudden changes brought on by this pandemic, such as maybe a job loss or other situations that can be disruptive to a person's life?
Yes, I think the first thing to acknowledge is to just be where you are. I know that sounds like a typical thing a psychologist would say, but, you know, we have an expression in the field, you have to name it to tame it. So having a look around at your life, at your social support system, having a close look at what you are doing. Are there things that you are doing that are healthy? Are there things that you are doing that you could improve a little bit on? How are you eating? Are you trying to keep a good sleep hygiene routine? And are you overdosing on social media, information overload? What I would suggest with that, because there's so much information available, is that you set aside maybe just a couple times a day to check in on current affairs, but that you not spend the entire day, you know, on media consumption, because I think that has more of an effect perhaps than a lot of us may think.
Yet staying at home also can be really tough for a lot of people to handle. Can we talk about that feeling of isolation and how to handle it in a healthy way?
Yes, so I think it's a recipe for stress, isn't it? The social isolation that a lot of us may not be used to, combined with what feels like a new normal, being around in sometimes confined spaces with people, even if it's our family members who we love dearly, they can sometimes, you know, be stressful to deal with. I think making some time for yourself every day, through meditation or prayer. We know that prayer has a lot of health benefits. I wouldn't underestimate that. Prayer affects neurotransmitters, for example, dopamine, which in turn increases well-being. Making a little bit of quiet space for oneself during the day, I think, is very important. And really being aware of the cognitive, the physical, and the emotional impact that this could have on oneself, and taking steps to ensure that you really take care of yourself. A lot of us are taking care of other people right now, but you can't take care of someone else if you're not taking care of yourself too.
Absolutely. Really great tips there. What's happening in the world right now, isn't just impacting us as adults, it's also changing life for children. What advice would you give parents on how to help their children process all of this?
I think the first thing is, again, check in with yourself, because children are masters at figuring out how we feel, even sometimes before we know. So the first thing is to remain calm, even if you're anxious. Try and see if you can check your anxiety a little bit so that you don't transfer it onto the children, even if it's just for a circumscribed period of time. And then help a child identify how they feel. If they say that they're afraid or they're unsure or they're angry, give a name to the feeling. Again, name it to tame it. We know that the brain changes when we know what we're dealing with. And then secondly, I would normalize it. The child is where they are. Sometimes children are much more aware of how they feel than we are. And normalize whatever it is that they feel. Try not to argue back with them by saying to them, oh, don't be afraid. Of course they're afraid. Sometimes they're just better at acknowledging what we're trying not to think about. And then I would redirect. If you spent a little bit of time there with the child, normalizing it, naming it, assuring the child that you're there for them, don't let the child spiral endlessly within that anxiety. Redirect, maybe go outside into for a walk if you can. If you can't, find an activity in the house that you could maybe do, but help the child redirect after acknowledging those strong feelings that they may have.
Oh, great advice. Thank you so much for your insight. Dr. Suzanne Holman, we appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Up next, Pope Francis tells the faithful how to find true security. And we'll meet a Catholic couple who did not let the coronavirus ruin their wedding plans. Pope Francis says there is a chance something good will come from the fight against the deadly coronavirus.
Fedeltà nei tempi buoni e nei tempi brutti.
At his daily Mass at the Vatican, the Holy Father says the fight should lead to greater unity among all people. He also says we should use the pandemic to remember that true security does not come from things of this world. Instead, it's from God, who loves us and protects us. The coronavirus has changed routines and canceled plans around the world, but for one Catholic couple, it has sped up their special day. Correspondent Mark Irons joins us now with that story. Mark?
Tracy, Joe and Mary Remlin had 200 confirmed guests for their wedding, which was supposed to take place this weekend. They were still weeks away from their big day when, in their words, God had other plans. Mary was still 3 weeks away from marrying her fiancé Joe when she got a call from their priest.
And he was like, well, Mary, I hate to tell you this, but unfortunately, after 8 p.m., all the churches in Maryland will be closed.
That meant no weddings for the foreseeable future. It was Monday, March 30th, and because of the spreading coronavirus, Maryland was hours away from enforcing its stay-at-home order. Monsignor Joseph Luca from St. Louis Parish in Clarksville, Maryland, mentioned one possibility.
He's like, but if you can get to the chapel today, I'll marry you today.
Mary, a nurse at St. Agnes Hospital in Baltimore, was in the middle of her shift. Her supervisor gave her permission to leave. She called Joe, a therapist who was right in the middle of a counseling session.
I stopped the session halfway through and said, I got to get out of here. Sorry, I got an emergency.
Mary changed from scrubs to her wedding dress. And back at his home, Joe couldn't find his wedding band.
Searching, no ring.
Separately, both rushed for the church.
And I'm booking it down I-95. I'm taking the key ring off off my keys, and sure enough, I can stretch that to fit. So okay, we got a ring.
What didn't fit? His suit from high school. He called Mary's brother.
I say, hey Jim, do you have a suit? And he's like, yeah, Joe, I got you covered.
Monsignor's kind of like glancing at his watch, like, where's the groom?
But with minutes to spare before 8 p.m., with a few family members on hand, Joe and Mary made it official.
The Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And now you may kiss the bride.
Mary and Joe say their wedding day reminded them of that gospel story when Jesus called his disciples. They left what they were doing, dropped their fishing nets behind, and followed him. And if you're wondering about that wedding ring that Joe couldn't find, he says after the wedding, he turned his room upside down. Eventually, he did find that ring. Tracy.
What a great story. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing that with us. God bless them. Correspondent Mark Irons reporting tonight. Thank you again, Mark. And before we go, a reminder, you may not find last-minute weddings on EWTN, but we do air Mass throughout the day. Mass airs at 8 a.m., noon, and 7 p.m. Eastern. We're also showing the Pope's daily Mass and other special programming throughout the day. We also have Eucharistic adoration from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. on our website, EWTN.com. We thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.